Hello, everyone. I'm Joan Kerr. Welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. We're coming to you from the Senate Chamber of the Old Capitol Museum, one of the Pentacrest museums on the Central Campus. Our production partners are UITV, the University of Iowa Pentacrest Museums, KRUI 89.7, and Information Technology Services. This program is being recorded for statewide television and radio distribution over UITV, Iowa Public Radio, and KRUI-FM. It will also be available along with all programs in this series as a free podcast on iTunes. Tonight our topic is Japan. An ancient culture and the most modern of nations, Japan is comprised of nearly 7,000 islands and holds the world's 10th largest population, over 127 million people. Greater Tokyo is the largest metropolitan area in the world with over 30 million residents, and Japan has the world's third largest economy as measured by GDP, and the longest life expectancy of any country in the world. Long an actor on the international stage, Japan's relationship with the U.S. has ranged from cordial and cooperative to adversarial in the extreme, facing one another as enemies in World War II. Its delicate arts and iconic architecture are known and treasured all over the world, and still many of us have done little but scratch the surface of Japan. Even the intense international interest following the tragic earthquake, tsunami, nuclear reactor threat, and personal devastation that hit the nation 1 year ago this month has been eclipsed in the minds of many by subsequent events. So we take the opportunity tonight to expand our understanding of Japan with an exceptional group of guests, beginning with the gentleman who's here with me on stage, Stephen Vlastos, Professor and Chair of the University of Iowa History Department. Professor Vlastos is also a past director of International Programs Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. So I want to say thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me and making Japan the subject of this program.
Oh, absolutely. I know it'll be an interesting evening. And I think that the best place for us to start is sort of with an overview, an historical context, a look at the culture, the long history and the more recent modern history.
Since I try and fail to do this in 15 lectures over the course of a semester, I am very anxious about trying to do this today without using up the entire program. But I guess that if I need to identify a few features of Japan that both gives us some indication to its historical development and what makes it somewhat unlike most other major countries. I guess I'd start with the fact of geography. As you just said, it's an island nation. It's made up of 4 main islands and then a 5th chain of islands and numerous others. These are on the eastern periphery of the great East Asian continent. Because of its location, since sort of proto-historic and historic times, Japan, unlike any other large and important country, has not been involved in large-scale migrations, emigrations, or immigrations, has not been involved in more than the occasional foreign war with foreign adversaries. Until 1945, there was no successful invasion of Japan. Until 1894, there was no successful Japan invasion of any of its neighbors. So it is a country that, through historical circumstances, has a degree of continuity in terms of culture, to a degree in terms of its institutions, and a degree in terms of its society that is characterized not by absolute homogeneity in any sense, but by an unusual, I think really unprecedented degree of a population that shares a common language, common religious traditions, similar racial stock, And this is, even today, perhaps in an exaggerated form, part of the identity of Japan.
And you study modern Japanese history, in addition to, all of the background you can give us going back many, many centuries. What period is considered modern Japanese history?
I'm sorry, what period?
What period would be considered modern Japanese history?
Well, modern Japanese history can be dated pretty precisely to the middle of the 19th century. It's in 1853 that Japan has its first violent encounter with Western imperialism in the form of Admiral Perry. And in relatively short order, that encounter provokes a revolt against the long-reigning warlord dynasty, the Tokugawa shogun, and within 15 years of arrival of Perry, there's a revolution which overthrows not just the dynasty, but proceeds very rapidly and very ruthlessly to dismantle feudal political, social, economic institutions, and very consciously to embark on a program of modernization using the West as a model. The West was the modern society at the time, and one can say that by the end of the 19th century, 4 or 5 decades later, Japan had achieved its goal. In usual indexes one uses for measuring the modernity, Japan by around 1900, certainly by World War I, satisfies most of the criteria we use for what is a modern state.
Mm-hmm. Well, Europe and the United States in the late 1800s became fascinated by Japanese art, by some of the design traditions and so on. You go to a museum and you look at Whistler's work, you look at some of the important artists from that period, and so often there are Japanese screens, there are women painted in kimonos and so on. What was it, do you think, that was it just that it was such a very different culture than most of us had seen represented before, that Europe and America became so charmed by this place?
Well, I think it's partly that Japan had remained inaccessible to the most part for as long as it had, even when it had developed a high and very sophisticated culture that was part of the attraction. Beyond that, I would say that in Japan as outside Japan, there's a kind of natural curiosity as to the various forms that culture takes. Visual culture is particularly subject to borrowing. The artists are very aware of conventions that are being used, what the possibilities are with particular conventions. And one should also point out that even though during the period that preceded the confrontation with the West, there was a window onto Japan. The Dutch maintained a trading station from the early 1600s. Japanese artists and scientists through the Dutch, through a very narrow window, but nevertheless were introduced to science, art, literature as was developing in the West, so that it wasn't entirely as if you had Rip Van Winkle awaking 2.5 centuries later and suddenly seeing a whole new world around him. Nor was it the case that people outside Japan were entirely unaware of this very high, very sophisticated culture that had been developing over these centuries.
And could you briefly tell us about the political systems that have operated, very broadly in Japan, the long dynasties, and then when did what we think of as the more modern system come into effect in Japan?
Well, Japan, I'd say, roughly went through two long periods prior to the 19th century. The first was a aristocratic culture, almost entirely confined to what the cities now known as Kyoto, at the time Heian-kyo. It developed an extraordinary culture, particularly in literature, both narrative prose and poetry, various pictorial art forms. In terms of the political institutions of the time, it started with pretty direct imitation of the Chinese dynastic system, the Tang dynasty, Tang system in particular, but then evolved into something similar to, but functioning according to the needs of a country, which are very different from China as a huge continental culture. So there's an aristocratic culture with an imperial family at the center that doesn't take a very direct role in politics. Is really a figure who confers legitimacy on other political elites. And that continues very peacefully for about 400 or 500 years until the middle of the 19th century, when real power really devolves to a provincial warrior class, various clans that are at each other's throat. And what's very interesting is that even after power, economic and certainly military power, have descended to the provincial warrior class, when they finally do seize power in their own right, they're quite content to leave the emperor where he is. That is, the person who confers legitimacy on the real power they command. And then so from the end of the 12th century down to the middle of the 19th century, you have a series of dynasties of shoguns, of military families who are the real rulers of Japan.
Well, excuse me, I know that some of your current research relates to the internment of Japanese Americans in the World War II period here in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're looking into there?
Yeah, this obviously relates more to America,
yes, right,
than it does to Japan. But one of the areas I've been teaching in and have research interest in is the internment of Japanese Americans, and that the background to that would be the fairly late, that is, in the latter part of the 19th century. Japanese, for the first time, began to emigrate. And they emigrated both to the east, south, and to the west. And when they went west, the first large group went to Hawaii, brought there as contract laborers on sugar and then later pineapple plantations. There was a second wave that went primarily to the west coast of the United States. And by the time we reached 1940, there are roughly 250,000 people of Japanese descent, ancestry, living either in the West Coast or in the Hawaiian Islands. Those who came as immigrants were denied by statute, by federal statute, the right to naturalize, and so they were all aliens. Their children, and sometimes grandchildren, even in 1940, having been born in the United States, were citizens. Nevertheless, given a kind of extraordinary racial fear that developed, which was accelerated by very particular anti-immigrant interests along the West Coast, sort of push forward a policy of singling out Japanese among other aliens in World War II. There were Italians, there were Germans, there were others, in fact, who were much more actively involved in subversive activities in the United States. But it was the Japanese, because of their racial otherness, because of the difficulty the West, but America always had in the fact that Japan had become a world power. It's sort of like us in terms of technology, but it's culturally different and it's racially different. And so Japan was threatening in a number of ways, and very unfortunately and very unjustly, it was the Japanese residents of the continental United States who are then subject to mass internment. And so this is the first sort of large 20th century massive violation of civil rights, sort of pre-Patriot Act example of this. Now, at the same time, as some of you may be aware, the even slightly larger population of Japanese in Hawaii were exempt. And of course, this makes no sense at all, given the fact that they were much closer to the war theater. They comprised 40% of the population, while the Japanese Americans on the entire West Coast were never more than 5%. But that's a long story, and one which needs to be investigated because it's such a blot on the history of this country.
Well, you may not feel there's enough time to talk about it now, but one of the other things I know you're looking at is cinematic representations, Hollywood presentations of Japan and Japanese people during that era. Is there anything you can say about that?
Well, there isn't a uniform view. Whenever you find an anti-immigrant movement, there always are. It doesn't something that happens spontaneously. It's something that comes because certain groups have very concrete economic or political interests, which they exploit. They also play upon stereotypes which are much more general within the society and the culture. And you see something like that happening with respect to Japanese Americans. And then, of course, there's always an international context. And so as Japan, in fact, became an aggressor in Asia, most notably from 1937 on, waged a brutal war of aggression, mainly in China at the time. The characteristics of Japanese abroad, Japanese who are part of the Japanese army, tended to be read back into the resident population of Japanese here. Again, not so unlike what happens after 9/11 in terms of people of Arab or Middle Eastern descent.
Well, we'll continue this. I'm going to bring up a couple of other people to join us now. For those of you listening, we've been talking with Professor Stephen Vlastos, and I'll be bringing up to the stage now Levi McLaughlin and Melissa Ann Marie Curley to join us. And as they get settled, I'll just explain that Melissa Ann Marie Curley is an assistant professor of Japanese religions in the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Iowa, and Levi McLaughlin is an anthropologist and a postdoctoral research associate in University of Iowa International Programs for this year. So thanks, both of you, for joining us. And you're both intimately familiar with Japan. And you've heard Stephen's comments so far, and he's going to stay with us and, of course, add thoughts to whatever you might all have to say. But I'll start with you, Melissa. And I would like you to tell us a little bit about religion in Japan. Obviously, again, an overwhelmingly broad topic, but many people will have heard of the Shinto tradition. Many people may be aware that there is a long history of Buddhist tradition in Japan. But start us off, please.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind in thinking about Buddhism and Shinto that is so important for understanding Japanese religions, which most people don't know, is that Shinto, although it's thought of as the ancient, indigenous tradition is actually sort of a new invention. Before that modern period that Stephen is talking about, we don't really see Shinto and Buddhism as separate entities in Japan. They're combined into a single kind of system. There's a really beautiful image for capturing that, which is, I think, very relatable. If you imagine yourself on a sunny day seeing a beam of sunlight coming through the window, and if you're not a very good housekeeper, then in the beam of sunlight there will be all these motes of dust. And the image that people use for talking about Shinto and Buddhism, how they relate to each other before the modern period, is that Shinto, the powers of Shinto, or the deities in Shinto, come from the earth of Japan, like those motes of dust. And Buddhism comes from the outside, like the radiance of the sun. So without the sun, you can't see the dust. But also without the dust, you can't see the sun. They have that kind of very intimate relationship. And then modernity comes, and the rulers of Japan realize modern nations have religions, and so we need something that's recognizable as religion, and we're going to take from this system one thing and we're going to call it Shinto, another thing we're going to call it Buddhism. And that's how you get this idea that there are these two discrete traditions.
Yeah. So what would the practice of these religions be like in Japan for the average family?
Oh gosh. Today, or, well, I mean, one of the things, and maybe Levi will agree with me, that can be tough about studying religion in Japan is that a lot of Japanese people will agree that there is no more religion in Japan. Sometimes the Japanese people are not very religious anymore.
It's one of the great paradoxes of the subject.
Absolutely. Yes. So if I think of something that kind of captures my interest in terms of what popular religious life is like, I think of something that people who have been to Japan will probably have seen, because you see them everywhere, these rows and rows of statues of a bodhisattva figure, a kind of saint figure called Jizo, who looks like he's very small and cute. Looks sort of like a baby. And there will just be sort of repeated rows, row after row of this one figure. And you can tell there's something institutional there, right? Some institution is producing all of these statues and selling them and installing them. But each statue will be dressed up in a little bib, with a little miniature bonnet, and maybe some toys have been given to it. And there you can see, some individual has taken an interest in this one particular statue, whether because they're associating it with the spirit of someone that they know, or they're associating it with the spirit of someone that they don't know. They're kind of taking care of that image in order to take care of the spirit in this very improvisatory way. So that's where I think Japanese religion is really alive, in that combination of institutional practice and individual practice. What do you think?
Actually, to pick up on that point, this is one of the great, as I mentioned, the great paradoxes. 2/3 of people in Japan will self-identify as having no religious faith. At the same time, if you ask them, what do you do at New Year's? Something like 70% of Japan will visit a shrine to go to pray to specific deities to usher in fortune for the coming year. 80% of people in Japan will visit the graves of their ancestors and the people who've passed on in their own families. The majority of households have a Buddhist altar, a Shinto shrine, or both installed. And these are the same people who will self-identify saying, we're not religious. The problem comes with what we were speaking about earlier, the era of modernity and the isms that are placed upon long-standing traditions that never self-identified as isms. And within that also is the rise of a lot of what are called new religious movements, which have gained a reputation, for better or worse, as being socially marginal. And so what's transpired, especially over the latter half of the 20th century, is strong self-identification as religious is associated with that type of aggressive or proactive religious faith, which is equated with being somehow outside of the mainstream. And these are things that have contributed to this really conflicted relationship of religion in contemporary Japan.
Yeah. Well, so tell us more about this group. Are you speaking about this Soka Gakkai?
Well, the group that I study the most is a group called Soka Gakkai. It's literally the Value Creation Study Association, which, again, paradoxically didn't even begin as a religion at all. It started as a group of people interested in educational reform who turned to a type of medieval Buddhism. And through this, they fused two legacies, one being this tremendous tradition of Buddhist transcendence that was available in Japan, with the Euro-American influences that were flooding in at the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And this was a tremendously successful combination. Today, Soka Gakkai, they claim 8.27 million households in the country. They're also all over the world under the umbrella of SGI, or Soka Gakkai International, actually Japan's most successful religious export, just based on numbers of converts alone. But they're widely, what they actually do, what ordinary members actually end up doing in their ordinary lives, not widely known, because they have been stigmatized for their two major things. One is the hardcore proselytizing, which is viewed as being somewhat against the norm in Japan, and involvement in electoral politics, which the 1947 Constitution guarantees a strict division of religion and state, something that people view Soka Gakkai as having contravened.
Mm-hmm. And so when you say that they're interested in politics or pushing a political agenda or whatever, from the West's point of view, would we consider these people progressive in their politics, or?
Very difficult to pigeonhole. Beginning, their political party, the affiliate, now independent officially from Soka Gakkai, is called Komeito, or the Clean Government Party. It's actually New Komeito as of the late 1990s. Began as this initiative to clean up politics and still maintains what we would call socially progressive platforms, particularly in the last year regarding initiatives to reform or rebuild Japan following the disaster. But for 10 years, between 1999 and 2009, they were affiliated with the Liberal Democratic Party, which is right-wing. So a little difficult to say where they stand in that regard.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that discussion of the sort of religious practice and culture in Japan, Stephen?
Well, there's the fact that both of you have spoken to is that the categories themselves, the one we're familiar with, don't do a very good job when you get to Japan. That the coming out of a monotheistic culture, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, we really don't the terms that exist in English when transferred into Japan don't convey what the experience is, either in terms of the expected performance or, more importantly, the spiritual aspect.
Mm-hmm. Well, Melissa, tell us something about, I know that in your description on your website talks about an interest you have in religion and exile, religion and the body. Can you talk a little bit about either of those?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things that really captures my attention in Levi's work is this idea that the groups he's looking at are overlooked by scholars in part because they're identified as socially marginal. And what I think is fascinating about that is that the most, to my mind, because they're the kinds of Buddhism that I study, the most beautiful, powerful forms of Japanese Buddhism emerge similarly from conditions of social marginality, from people who are socially marginal during a time of great social upheaval. And I think, although sometimes there's a tendency to think of Japan as a kind of conformist culture, a culture that's very interested in uniformity. If we look at it historically, religious movements, at least, have come out of a really radical embrace of separateness and difference and multiplicity. That's a real source of religious power, and I think that's still true today. You can really see the movements that I'm looking at now who have become very conservative in some ways as they've become more socially acceptable, almost trying to reclaim a marginal position with the sense that only the socially marginal have the moral authority to criticize the state. So even though we're actually very rich and powerful, we have to look at the socially marginal and try to be more like them. That's a dynamic that I find really amazing and very moving.
Yeah,
I suppose another thing that is kind of worth pointing out with respect to religion and its history in Japan is the really remarkable, in fact, I'd say unprecedented degree of religious tolerance. I mean, there's no other, at least as far as I know, other large developed society where there is a world religion which then coexists with a native animistic tradition, and both the world religion, that is Buddhism, and and Shinto in its various forms, not 100%, but compared to anywhere else, they managed to get along together. They managed to coexist, and there's an extraordinary degree of syncretism that will flow in and out, and sometimes more. And it is one aspect of Japan, I think, that is underappreciated.
Mm-hmm. What about Christianity? You know, the presence of Judaism, Mormonism, some of these various branches of religion that we know here. Have they moved into Japan? Is there a presence in Japan of some of these?
There are about 1 million Christians in Japan. This is less than 1% of the population,
really?
And not for lack of trying.
Yeah.
You name the denomination, they've banged their head against that wall for many years. There are two major reasons that you could account for. There are two major ones you could mention. One is there is a history of persecution of Christianity. There was something called the Christian century when Portuguese missionaries arrived in the middle of the 1500s and were ultimately driven out and martyred and ushering in a period of closed country, essentially. One of the major reasons why Japan was cut off for 2.5 or so centuries from the rest of the world, with a few minor exceptions. The other is that with the reintroduction of Christianity from the 19th century onwards, by and large, Christian groups didn't do a very good job of nativizing, of making their practices relevant to the everyday lives of ordinary people in Japan. And so the legacy of that is that Christianity retains this image as being foreign, being exotic, being associated with going overseas, with learning a foreign language, with doing something that is not Japanese, in other words. And so it hasn't really been able to shake that image, and many, many missionaries have tried.
I think what Levi's saying really captures the reason for the incredible difference between the success of Christianity in Korea and its pretty dramatic lack of success in Japan. This idea that, in Korea, Christianity is able to position itself as something for the people. And in Japan, that just doesn't happen.
Hasn't happened.
Yeah, at the same time, it's worth pointing out that Japanese Christians have a vastly disproportionate influence in society, primarily through education, art, literature. Even though that numerically it's really quite marginal, it's an important part of the overall mix of Japanese culture today.
Mm-hmm. In these last many decades, with so many students traveling internationally, studying in many, many foreign nations, and later on we're going to have a guest with us here who spent almost 2 years with us from Japan, Yume Hideka. Has this, in the last 20, 30 years, caused some changes in Japan as well? Are there lots of exchange students, for example, that come in to study in high schools and college in Japan? And does Japan send many students to the U.S.? Or to Germany?
Stephen would have a greater perspective on this topic. I'm thinking myself. I first went to Japan in 1993 as an exchange student.
Oh yeah.
And it was a transformative experience. Basically, it hooked me for life. That's almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
I've seen the country transform immensely, and also the experience of studying abroad. It was an enormous, even then, it was the early 90s. It was an enormous leap to go spend a year.
Yeah.
There were lots of students doing it. It was quite established by that point. Now the back and forth is almost routine. There are people who commute from the west coast of the United States to Japan weekly. The notions of distance, both culturally and geographically, have transformed. And as a result of really conscientious efforts made at the state level and also on individual levels to strengthen ties between the two places, I would say.
Yeah. Well, and with instant and sort of constant communication worldwide through every sort of gadget you can imagine, and the visibility of one culture and another culture through news programs, through entertainment programs, and so on. Have you witnessed, do you think, during your lifetimes, changes in I'll ask you, Stephen, in the way a Japanese individual might engage with the outside world than perhaps their parents would have? Just openness.
Well, since I'm clearly the oldest one here on the stage, and the one who went to Japan at an earlier time, I've noticed just a complete change in terms, not complete change, but enormous change in terms of how young people in Japan see themselves in relationship to non-Japanese and people from the West in particular. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that the great majority of Japanese today see themselves as world citizens, mm-hmm. not very different from the way that most Americans or Brits or Spaniards or Russians mm-hmm. see themselves as world citizens. That was really not true. I mean, it was partly the legacy of the war, mm-hmm. and the war of the occupation, when travel by Japanese was severely restricted. Partly the legacy of a system of language pedagogy, second language acquisition that was not the very best, mm-hmm. to say the least. But I think that I sense a real change today. Is that your experience as well?
And I mean, one thing that's really delightful in the classroom is that because those flows are going in both directions, very often in Japanese religions classes, I find my students have knowledge of very arcane pieces of Japanese religious thought and practice coming from really surprising places, So I'll try to I'm going to tell them something they've never heard of. I'm going to tell them about this kind of mythical goblin badger creature called the tanuki, and I'm going to just knock their socks off. And then I go in and I just say the word tanuki, and all the students are, oh, of course. Because it's in a Nintendo game, we know this for sure. We know all about this. And I was talking to a friend who teaches about Thai Buddhism in Vermont, and he said, I teach about Thailand and Vermont, and you teach about Japan and Iowa, and isn't it tough to teach students about a culture they know nothing about? My students don't know anything about Thailand, and I said, my students know so much about Japan before I ever get to them. It's a culture they're so comfortable with, and that makes it so fun. Yeah,
and these are not just students of Japanese origin.
Absolutely not. No.
Yeah. Well, I know you're teaching a class now on youth culture in Japan, aren't you,
Yes,
Levi?
that's right.
But what kinds of topics are you discussing in that class?
Well, I mean, most of the students arrive having been immersed in anime, manga. This is, I think, the majority of people under the age of 25 or so. This is their interface with Japan. And so things like tanuki or, odd sort of vocabulary of mythology and other things related to Japanese culture comes through that way. I'm actually, in a way, weaning them, using that as a Trojan horse, I have to admit, if my students are here, but as an introduction to contemporary issues. And I'm delighted by the fact that they're quite happy to contextualize the stuff that they've taken up so far and put it into terms of real people living the lives of ordinary folks, mm-hmm. who are living in a place that and on the surface appears to be peaceful and maybe monolithic, is actually rife with conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, and just thinking in terms of, pop culture, for years and years and years, we all were seeing videos of Michael Jackson, for example, going to Japan, or Madonna, or somebody who was sort of a huge star in the West, loved at least as much in Japan as we might imagine somebody would get stormed in New York City or in Houston or something. But, the world has made everybody closer on the pop culture level, anybody who's interested. What are some of the differences? We've talked a little bit about how, in many ways, we're all sort of part of this one world, this sort of big global experience. But what are the ways in which you think youth in Japan are still, perhaps, you would think that they're different just in their mindset from kids growing up in the States, for example? Is there anything that you would think of?
I could put into just one general characteristic. A lot of the stuff that we take for granted as being Western, say clothing, was brought in at a much later period to Japan. And so as a result of that, it had a whole different career. The same goes with music. And so on the surface, people may appear to wear similar looking things, or they may listen to similar sounding music, but it has behind it a whole different series of connections. And it is also, people in Japan are able to draw on a whole other vocabulary of experiences and images and sounds that we would find unfamiliar. These things conflate, they fuse in really intriguing ways. And you're finding this with the flow out of Japan into the West. I mean, notably things like the manga and the anime, strikingly different, strikingly alluring to people overseas as a result of these kinds of combinations. Yeah.
Well, to talk just a little bit more about your work, your field work in anthropology, as you mentioned earlier, the practitioners of Soka Gakkai, you said they're kind of very quiet about what they do, in the sense of you're sort of maybe they're, well, you'll have to tell me what it is there, but I think you said that sometimes it's hard to see exactly what they're doing because they are sort of, I don't know, on the margins, and they maybe keep themselves separate.
Step back for just one moment. The Soka Gakkai has long been the elephant in the room when it comes to the study of religion in Japan, because it's so big and so controversial. And though it's ubiquitous, no one really knew about what ordinary members, what ordinary practitioners were doing. And so from the year 2000 or so up till now, I've been spending years at a time at first, and then subsequently months, and then weeks at a time, living with members of Soka Gakkai in Tokyo and other parts of Japan, taking part in doctrinal training exercises, playing violin in one of their 5 symphony orchestras that's in Tokyo. All as a non-member participant, and people were extraordinarily open and generous in allowing me to take part, extremely sincere in the desire to have a grossly misunderstood organization made human, in a sense. And so this was my approach. And one big reason why the group has been maligned is the legacy of another organization called Om Shinrikyo. In 1995, March 20th, 10 members of Om Shinrikyo boarded Tokyo subways and opened sarin gas and nerve toxin, killing 12 people, injuring thousands, and then plunging the reputation of religions into the sewer for, since then. Yeah. And so what the net effect has been, essentially, is a cognitive link between new religious movements and violence and fear. And so all the groups, Soka Gakkai among them, have been pushing back against this sort of prevailing image of religion, especially new religions, as being somehow dangerous. Yeah,
I see. And so you'll continue to work with these people over some time?
As long as they'll have listened to me and let me take part.
Yeah. And Melissa, before we break this segment, can you tell me what the notion of Pure Land is?
Sure. So in the medieval period, during this time of great upheaval, as people were trying to think about better possibilities, they drew on this image of a kind of pocket universe in the West where everything is made of gold and jewels, and your lunch is served every day. It's so delicious, you don't even need to eat it, just smelling it is enough. Everything's sort of covered in rainbows. They drew on that image and tried to think hard about how they could turn this world into that kind of beautiful place, that place of happiness. And after the war, in a kind of similar situation of upheaval, people drew on that image again and tried to think about, okay, now that we're sort of devastated, how are we going to turn this world that we live in? After the war, they said, not so much a happy place, but a place of equality and freedom and justice for everybody. So it's that reinvention of the happy place as a place of equality that really is what's interesting to me in my research. And of course, because this is also a time of upheaval, not only in Japan but in the world, I'm really interested in how people are going to draw on that image of a beautiful land again and think about, okay, what would it be like if this world was beautiful again?
Mm-hmm. Either of you guys have anything to say in response to this notion of pure land?
Sounds nice.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thanks to you guys. Levi, I'd like to keep you here, but thank you, Stephen Vlastos and Melissa Ann Marie Curley, for joining us to talk about these things. I appreciate it very much. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me.
You bet. Thank you. And so we will invite our next guests on stage here. Thanks. Barrett Thomas and Ann Campbell will be joining us in just a moment. This is WorldCanvass, a production of international programs at the University of Iowa. And we invite you to watch the rebroadcast of this program on UI-TV or listen on Iowa Public Radio or KRUI-FM. Links to the broadcast can be found at International Programs website, international.uiowa.edu. And the full WorldCanvass series may be seen on UI-TV and is available as a downloadable podcast on iTunes. I'd like to invite you to the next program in this series, which will be held here in this room, the Senate Chamber, on April 13th, and the topic that night will be global science fiction. So I think that'll be fun, and that's on Friday, April 13th at 5 o'clock, so join us if you can. So with me now are two new guests. We're going to talk about Japan's post-war economic boom and its more recent economic troubles. We're going to look at what we can gather from this massive 2011 earthquake, tsunami, nuclear near disaster, and staying with us is Levi McLaughlin, whom you've already met. Ann Campbell is just next to him. Ann is an associate professor of management sciences and Martha and Dennis Hesse research fellow in the Tippie College of Business. Thanks for coming, Ann. And just next to me is Barrett Thomas. Thank you for being here. Barry's an associate professor of management sciences and faculty director of the University of Iowa's MBA Strategic Innovation Career Academy, also the Leonard A. Hadley research fellow in the Tippie College of Business. So I'm going to start with you, Barry. After World War II, Japan sort of, I don't know, it reimagined itself, came to a great economic boom. I mean, all kinds of successes. We're all aware of how many decades now Japanese automobiles and electronics and so on have been at the top of every list. And one hears about something loosely called the Japanese corporate model or business models in Japan that may, at least in the past, have been quite different from other models we were more used to. So I wanted to have you talk to us about that and perhaps use Toyota as an example.
Sure. Well, I think one way to look specifically at the initial post-war period is Japan had lower labor costs than other places in the world, and thus could be thought of as the China of its time. But clearly it transformed from there into more value-added type of manufacturing in particular. And certainly as you look at the current period or even the last 25 years, it would be hard to say that there's one Japanese business model, just like any other dynamic economy on Earth. There are many of those, and you have companies now like Sony and Nintendo who are probably wishing they were more like Apple.
Yeah.
But certainly there has been a success in a model that's been exported around the world, and that is most closely linked with Toyota. And I think we originally would call that the Toyota production system. Although more recently we've seen that the system and the thinking has been applied well outside of manufacturing, and I would say right now the forefront of that is in healthcare. And I think the way then we would describe it now is as lean thinking. And so I would roughly characterize lean thinking as continuous improvement that eliminates waste. And our definition of waste is anything that the customer doesn't value, anything that the customer isn't willing to pay for. And particularly in the US, and this was most true in the 80s and even into the 90s, what we really saw of this model were the kinds of tools that Toyota in particular was applying in its factories. So we were importing ideas such as just-in-time production. That is, that you deliver inventory to the production line at the exact moment that it's needed. Or, for instance, the idea that's roughly called 5S in the Toyota culture, which is really a system and a way of thinking about workplace organization. But the Toyota model really goes much deeper than this set of tools. In fact, a tool like 5S really has its roots more in Frederick Taylor in the 1880s in the steel industry in the United States. So Toyota certainly brought that into their toolkit, but it wasn't the thing that I think made them successful. I think what the division that happens between the way that we were operating sort of a Western production philosophy versus what was happening in Japan really comes back to that question of value. And if you go back to Frederick Taylor and then Henry Ford, who really was probably the best known embodiment of this, the real focus was on the production assets. It was on the machines, and it was on making those machines as efficient and as productive as possible. Well, as Toyota began to rebuild its manufacturing after World War II, there were numerous problems, in particular with trying to replicate the Ford model. The Ford model relied heavily on capital-intensive equipment, and Toyota simply didn't have the capital to purchase that equipment. And frankly, their market wasn't big enough at the time. They were going to have to produce for a Japanese market that, unlike Ford, that certainly at that point would be producing millions of vehicles, Toyota was looking at producing thousands of vehicles. So they really had to rethink the model in order to be successful. And what they did was really focused on this customer value. And that fundamentally changes the way you look at structuring your production. And in fact, as I noted earlier, it can fundamentally change the way you look at even running a healthcare system or a financial services company as well.
Yeah. Well, I think, not knowing this in any depth at all, one of the things I had imagined that really sort of represented this Japanese model was that sort of respect for one's workers and being able to stop the production line if you saw something going wrong. This was the sort of top-line thing that had lived in my head. Is that part of this?
Oh, absolutely. And this comes again back to that question of looking at the efficiency of the productive asset versus driving customer value. And certainly a distinction, if you would look at Henry Ford's production line, certainly in the pre-war period and even the post-war period, versus what Japan was doing, is that Henry Ford was breaking down the jobs, a division of labor, which of course happens at Toyota, but each person would be assigned to a job, and they would do that job all day, every day, until somebody left and maybe they got the opportunity to move on. And there would be not only then those production workers doing the specific assembly task, but you would have other workers who were doing, sort of housekeeping tasks. And then you would have a very separated engineering organization. And it's in that engineering organization that improvement would come from. And this actually goes back to Frederick Taylor in the 1880s and up to the early 1900s, where he would have, in his Principles of Scientific Management, he says very clearly that we must separate the tasks of managing the production from that of actually doing the production. Well, there were a number of reasons that this changed. One, some of this was governmental, that period was difficult in Japan, obviously. And there became that system, this sort of contract between the company and labor that was essentially this employment for life. Well, as the father of the Toyota production system, Taiichi Ohno, was looking at this, he realized, well, that created a fundamental difference with Henry Ford, who was willing to simply replace the worker if that worker wasn't productive enough. Taiichi Ohno had to figure out, how can I actually make this worker as productive as possible, because I'm in a contract with them for life. And what that meant was that you needed to involve, get the most out of that worker, and that meant not only their work, but their mind. And so he came to view it that the worker is actually closest to the production, and thus the worker might actually know best how to improve that production system. And what's fascinating is that some of these similar ideas were part of a U.S. government program during World War II called Training Within Industry, where they had exactly this concept, because clearly there was crisis, and at that point they had to figure out how to produce as much as possible, as fast as possible, and the program had within it guidelines for including workers in the improvement. We completely lost that in the U.S. at the end of World War II. Partially, we had a workforce returning who wasn't part of this training within industry. The government stopped the program, thinking it wasn't necessary, and there certainly was no crisis, because most of the rest of the productive capacity in the world was devastated, and so we didn't have that need here. And as I was rereading some things in preparation for this show, there's a quote that John Shook gives in the book on training within industry. And John Shook was the first American to work for Toyota, where he talks about discovering this training within industry manual while he was at Toyota City in Japan, and realizing that this was actually a U.S. government program. So it's very interesting.
Wow. And so in the last, 20 years or so, has this model become part of sort of most modern production lines, would you say, in industrialized countries?
Yeah, I would say most advanced manufacturing companies, certainly in the U.S. and Europe, will now have adopted these. I mean, interestingly, though, GM, for instance, had a joint venture with Toyota in 1984 in a former GM plant in Fremont, California, that was called NUMMI. And NUMMI has just closed a couple years ago. But this was sort of, Toyota entered into the joint venture because they were fearing tariff, and I think that GM needed help with making small cars that actually made money. So they thought this would be a good marriage. And in fact, what they ended up doing, the Fremont plant had been closed for about a year. They took workers, UAW workers from that plant, flew them over to Japan, and trained them on the Toyota production lines with Toyota workers. And they came back, and within 18 months to 2 years, this was certainly one of the most efficient plants in GM, and probably rivaled some of the Toyota plants as well. The problem was that this success didn't export itself to the rest of GM until much more recently. And it really comes down to having that crisis that forces you to change, because there is that change management question. And many people within GM didn't see the need to change. Leadership wasn't aligning the organization and incentivizing in a way that would have driven change. And it just simply didn't happen. But certainly that's changed, particularly as we know, GM and Chrysler themselves were bankrupt. So this has definitely become very common.
So interesting. Thank you so much. That's a very
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you bet. And Ann, we're going to switch gears just a little bit here. And I mentioned earlier that you're a specialist in logistics, and you have done a lot of research and a lot of work on the logistics of setting up disaster relief. And although you're not a specialist in the Japanese disaster relief of the last year or so, can you tell us what it takes to sort of energize an international community or even a more regional area to assist with disaster relief?
Sure. I was thinking about it quite a bit today in preparation for the show, and it really is kind of hard to give an exact formula, obviously, because every disaster is quite a bit different, but there do tend to be a similar chain of events that tend to happen. Usually once a national or regional disaster happens, the government officials try to assess what things they can do themselves with the supplies they have, the military they have, the Red Cross that they have in their own country. And then once they assess what they don't have, they put out a call for other governments to donate, or NGOs to donate as well. They may be very, very specific that they want certain kind of supplies, or very broad that we need sort of everything. And then usually the different groups start mobilizing into action. And almost every disaster you look at, that mobilization is challenging. There's a lot of logistical issues, like you said, has really been a lot of my study. Because if you think about, often roads are destroyed and flooding, and can really make the transportation hard. Also, communication is very hard. We all rely on cell phones to communicate everything, and so if you think about managing a huge logistics effort and you have no way to communicate, that is really challenging. And also coordination, if you have 400 different NGOs bringing food and water, and trying to coordinate that so that everybody gets some, tends to be a very big challenge. So those tend to be some of the issues that come up.
Could you kind of walk us through one of the disaster relief episodes that you're really familiar with, to sort of give us an example?
Well, I think one that is a really big contrast and comparison with Japan that we're all pretty familiar with is what happened with Haiti a few years ago, because on some levels it seems really similar, and that we've got an earthquake, we've got an island, but pretty much the similarity sort of in there, in that Haiti was a very poor country, or is a very poor country, I should say, was not prepared. They don't have a lot of infrastructure in terms of government, military, supplies. They were really not ready for something like that to happen. So when the government assessed what they needed, they kind of needed everything. So that's why you had many, many NGOs and governments mobilizing to go in there. But then we had almost an infinite number of logistical challenges with the fact that the main airport wasn't working for a while, so there was no way to get to an island flying. And then we had problems with the ports. They weren't operational for a while, so then when we were ready to go, we had tons of things to ship over from Miami, and figuring out the priorities of what to ship when, and then getting things served to different people so that we got a balance across the whole country was sort of a logistical nightmare in some way, because you had so many different NGOs trying to help out, and a lot of inefficiency in organizing that. So you had the UN involved trying to coordinate it, and just a very challenging situation from a logistical side. Where Japan is really different. From one side, they're, like you mentioned earlier, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And they were also almost hyper-prepared for an earthquake. They knew earthquake was a very distinct possibility given their location and their history of seismic events. So they had, stockpiles of certain supplies ready to go. They had people prepared with procedures on what they would do, and just a very different situation. They had a Red Cross that had 2 million volunteers and had a sort of a plan. So once things happened and they assessed what they needed was very minimal compared to a Haiti situation. So actually what they asked for was a very small number of things and very specific things, unlike Haiti. For example, they asked for search and rescue experts, they asked for medical people, and they asked for some help with dealing with the nuclear reactor assessment. They didn't really want big NGOs coming in. They really felt like they weren't going to manage it themselves. So that really was a big difference in terms of the amount of aid needed, because they had so much ready, and then the logistics become a little bit different. If everything is sort of government run, the amount of coordination is a little bit better, because you don't have so many NGOs trying to communicate with each other. There were still some logistical challenges, because still, a couple thousand roads were destroyed by the earthquake, and you had the evacuation from the nuclear reactor. But it seems like, in general, you could say things went smoother because of what their situation was. Obviously not perfect, but definitely a lot smoother from the logistics side.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that the UN sort of was trying to help coordinate things with Haiti, for example. Is it usually the UN that would step in some sort of international effort like that, where the country really has no political preparedness?
That has become, in my understanding, one of the missions of the UN coordination of humanitarian, or Council for Humanitarian Affairs, because of the disasters. We've seen so many in the last 15 years. Particularly in different countries, we've seen coordination be such a problem that that's something they've stepped up to be willing to do. in countries where it is needed. So I don't think they've had much involvement to that level in Japan because the government had so much coordination and really wanted to take charge of it. So I don't think they come in unless they're really asked to, but I think a lot of organizations have seen coordination really is such a big challenge because you want to get things delivered as fast as possible, and working out a really good plan is challenging to do really quickly. So that's why you've seen FEMA care a lot more about it in the United States, and then the UN be involved on an international scene, trying to have someone who's sort of involved in the coordination. But my impression is in Japan, the government of Japan did most of the coordination, but there wasn't as much involving external parties. It was more having their local Red Cross and, do a lot of the first response and a lot of other things being done by the military and everybody kind of having their own jobs.
Well, Levi, this is a good place for me to turn to you because I know that you've been doing a lot of work on this past year, what the experience has been for individual people, for communities, certainly the Fukushima problems. Take us through what some of you have been
Maybe I'll start with that just to add an angle on the specific situation. There was extensive coordination, but February 27th, the report was issued in Japanese by it's called the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation. The English language version is forthcoming. It's an independent organization headed up by the former editor-in-chief of one of the major newspapers called the Asahi Shimbun. And they interviewed 300 people, including the then Prime Minister, Kan Naoto, who was at the front lines of the Fukushima disaster. And two things are clear. One is that this is the worst nuclear disaster in history. And the second is that this is not a natural disaster. And the scariest part of the report that came out was that how close Japan was to annihilation, essentially. TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, was on the brink of pulling out completely after the first 3 of the 6 Fukushima Daiichi plants melted down. They lied about how bad it was, and they were actually, it took the prime minister arriving, bungling some things, micromanaging and possibly confusing the situation. So it's a mixed bag of things there. But essentially, he ordered them back in. And so the storied Fukushima 50, we've come to hear about the 50 TEPCO workers who stayed on, entered the irradiated plant to cool down the nuclear rods that had been exposed, were basically there despite, not because of TEPCO's orders. Had the worst case scenario played out, there would have been a 250-kilometer radius of uninhabitable irradiated space, which would have included Tokyo. That is to say, 30 million people would have had to have evacuated. So that's how close Japan came to essentially being wiped out politically, at least for, the projected scenarios are absolutely terrifying. So given that, things have worked out, I suppose, to a fairly manageable level, but something like 150,000 plus people remain displaced. There's an area of 20 kilometers or so around the plant where people will never be able to return to their homes. The stigma of Fukushima, both in terms of business and socially, will stick with people possibly for generations. And this was a result of a collusion between industry and government that goes back to the immediate post-war era up to the present. So to speak a little bit about industry, Barry, you were mentioning the success story of Toyota. A lot of that also becomes because of the back and forth between very elite bureaucrats and technocrats in the government, with corresponding with and sharing power with people in industry. This has had some salutary effects, obviously. Japan ballooned into the second largest economy, which isn't bad for a place that has no natural resources. But the cost of that is depending 30% of the power coming from nuclear. And the nuclear industry, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry simultaneously having the responsibility to regulate and promote nuclear power. So the conflict in that led to insufficient standards of safety. Mm-hmm. And what's come out of that is a rising grassroots protest initiative on the part of a lot of people in Japan who no longer trust the government, and they certainly don't trust information coming from TEPCO or other utilities. And they're starting to do things that this generation has never seen. They're starting to do things like protest. They're taking up what's called citizen science. They're driving around with Geiger counters and gathering data on radiation levels all across the country and uploading it to publicly accessible web platforms. They are starting new NGOs, new NPOs, new transnational and international relations are being forged as a result of cynicism and dissatisfaction with the status quo.
So you said it was a man-made, not a natural disaster.
It should not have happened.
So even with the tsunami, even with the terrible earthquake and so on, if appropriate safety standards were in place when this was
That's great. Well, what everyone was told was that those were in place.
Yeah.
And that the plant was safe because of the high levels of safety standards and because of the high level of education of the plant workers, that they were ready to respond. What transpired, only 6% of casualties actually happened because of the quake, stark contrast to Haiti. The rest of the 20,000 or so people who were killed by the tsunami that rushed in. But one of the reactors was actually melted down because of the quake damage and not because of the tsunami. They were absolutely not ready.
Wow. So what do we know about the, in addition to what you said in regard to the people going around with their own Geiger counters and double checking on government numbers or whatever, what do we know about the personal and psychological state of Japanese people who are obviously not going to see the kind of life again in that area near Fukushima that they had enjoyed for generations?
The level of trauma is profound. The initial, and this is something perhaps you could speak to as well about how there's the initial response to rescue missions, and then after that, the long-term care for those who are traumatized by loss and also other forms of post-traumatic stress. That's certainly what's been happening. One of the Fukushima-specific things is that families have been split apart and are forced to hold up two households. The pattern that's generally taken is that mothers with children are living very far away in different parts of the country for fear of exposing their kids to radiation, while fathers who are making the money for the family are forced to commute into dangerous areas to keep the family livelihood flowing. And so this has created a further level of stress, which is specific to that area.
And how much does a resident of Tokyo, I mean, obviously very aware that this has all happened and certainly, feel the pain of it in the way that many of us who live in Iowa might feel the pain of a 9/11. But did it affect the lives of people in Tokyo, or does it still?
Enormously. The initial impact was absolutely huge. People who could leave did. And today, people don't trust produce, fish, rice. In other words, the absolute staples of the diet. Their prices of these have skyrocketed. There have been increases in consumption tax as a result to cover the costs that have been accrued. The disaster is the most expensive in human history. The price tag before Fukushima was $230 billion US. So, and a lot of that is, of course, addressed to the loss of manufacturing power in the northeast of Japan.
Yeah. So for the Japanese economy, I don't know if you would have this if you would be able to share this with us or not, but in this global economic kind of downturn or topsy-turvy situation we're living in right now, what is the Japanese economy like? And if you could say before the whole earthquake happened, and then in this last year, do you know anything about how their economy is doing?
Well, I'll admit to not being an expert on the Japanese economy, but the earthquake clearly had a global impact on economies. And you sort of start with Toyota as an example. Toyota is sort of well known for having their suppliers close. So they have their main assembly plant in Japan is based in Toyota City, even with suppliers very close to it. So they can do numerous of these just-in-time deliveries every day. Well, it turns out those are really their first-tier suppliers. And the suppliers that supply their suppliers and sort of on down were often in this devastated area. And as a result, that really disrupted supply for Toyota. Well, it turns out in the world economy where we are interconnected, and certainly firms have outsourced a lot of their activities, not only did the Japanese companies, Honda and Nissan use these suppliers, but American suppliers use them, particularly for paint. So this had an enormous impact even on production in the U.S. Yeah. And so that there's this ripple effect across the world economy. And just outside of the tsunami and earthquake, the issue that they're facing now is that the yen, particularly relative to the dollar, is extraordinarily high. So what you're seeing is many Japanese manufacturing firms, and notably Nissan and Honda, moving more and more production out of Japan and quite often into the U.S. market, which is, of course, the largest auto market in the world. Toyota, interestingly, has not made that as big a move as those other companies yet, but it has affected their profit with the high yen.
Any sort of concluding comments? Anything else you'd like to say related to Fukushima or the current state of Japan?
Well, this is a real pivotal moment in the modern history of Japan. In the way that people think of 9/11, people are actually using the term 3/11, and there is a sort of pre and post feel to it, and only time will tell what the legacy of this will be.
Yeah. And I wanted just to echo something he mentioned earlier about the psychological impact. When I said earlier they were prepared for an earthquake in terms of procedures, they weren't prepared for the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown combination, which I agree was totally something they were not prepared for. And it does seem to be something you see over and over, that it created a lot of people being very fearful, and they think one of the relief efforts is a lot of psychological support. So
I can
totally
imagine.
agree with that.
Well, I want to say thank you so much, Levi McLauglin, and Ann Campbell and Barrett Thomas. Thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And so I'd like to invite our last group of guests up. We have Sonia Ryang and Carol Grant and Yume Hidaka, and Downing Thomas will be joining us as well. In this last segment of the program, we're going to focus on some of the many connections between Iowa and Japan, and we have really a wonderful group of people here with us. And Downing Thomas is just to my left here. He's Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs at the University of Iowa. Thanks for coming, Downing. And Carol Grant is just next to him. She's Executive Director of Iowa Sister States. Thanks, Carol, for coming. And hi, Sonia. Sonia Ryang is a professor of anthropology and the director of International Programs Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. Thanks for being here. And at the far end is Yume Hidaka, who's the Japan Outreach Initiative coordinator, who's been working with us in international programs and traveling all over the state for the last almost 2 years now. And it's wonderful to have you here. Thanks so much, Yume. So I want to start with you, Downing. You have just come back from a trip to Japan with members of the U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy and the J Center that is now part of that group. And first of all, I'd like you to sort of share your impressions of Japan and the educational colleagues you worked with there, and then also talk a little bit about opportunities to study Japan and Japanese culture here at the university.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Just back about a week, I think, Carol, even less than that. So the J Center, if I could maybe start there, the J Center is the result of a grant from the Japan Foundation to essentially create a database of connections between U.S. activities and organizations and partners in Japan, ranging across business, education, K through 12, higher education, community groups, so everything from bonsai growers in Bemidji to high schools and middle schools that have partner institutions in Japan. And so the idea of the J Center is to gather this information in one database for the Midwestern states and to encourage people to come see the activities that are going on. So by gathering the information, we can better understand where the connections are and build on those connections and create potentially more connections. My own background doesn't involve Japan. This was my first trip to Japan, in fact, so I have no authority whatsoever on the topic, but learned a lot, and certainly the disasters of 3/11 came up at every single meeting, I believe, that we attended, whether it was with the embassy in Tokyo or with Joetsu University of Education, our partner institution in Japan with the College of Education here at the University of Iowa. In fact, we'll have some faculty members here this week, this coming week, from Joetsu with student teachers to go to some area schools to visit those. And I hope in the future what we're hoping to establish is a reciprocal flow of student teachers from our College of Education here at the University of Iowa to Joetsu City and the region to be able to teach in English-speaking schools in that area and have some support from the University of Education there in Joetsu.
Yeah, terrific. Well, you mentioned that Carol was on this trip as well, so I'll just turn it to you for a second, Carol. And was this your first trip to Japan? Or
it was my second trip.
Second, yeah. Well, we have lots of things to talk about. What the Iowa Sister States is, first of all, perhaps I'll just ask you to tell us what your organization does.
Certainly. Iowa Sister States manages Iowa's 8 international partner state relationships. And our relationship with Japan is the oldest, longest-standing relationship. And it's got a great story. The genesis of that relationship goes back to 1959. It's kind of a classic Iowa kind of story. A Iowa farmer stationed in the Air Force in Japan at that time learned of disaster, back-to-back typhoons that had occurred in Yamanashi Prefecture. And those disasters were devastating to the livestock, the crops, homes. Many people lost their lives, and so he felt real empathy as a farmer. So he wrote back home and enlisted fellow Iowa farmers in donating hogs. And this became the Iowa Hog Lift. And in January of 1960, 35 Iowa hogs were flown by the U.S. Air Force to Yamanashi, and about 1,500 tons of corn were shipped so that they had enough to eat until the crops were replenished in Yamanashi. And the pork now available in Japan has genetic precursors to those original 35 Iowa hogs.
Yeah.
It's a great story.
It's terrific.
The reaction of Yamanashi from this gift was in 1962. They sent a bronze temple bell to Iowa. And that bell has been ensconced in a structure on the south grounds of the Iowa Capitol in Des Moines since that time, and in their appreciation. The bell is, of course, gorgeous, and all around the outside of the bell, the story is retold in both Japanese and in English, the story of the devastation and the reaction that Iowans helped out.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned that in May there's going to be a celebration of another sort.
Yes. We celebrated the 50th anniversary with Yamanashi last summer and rededicated the bell after doing some refurbishing of the structure and the surrounding gardens. Prior to that, we found an opportunity and submitted an application to be considered for a gift of cherry blossom trees. 2012 is the 100th anniversary of the original gift of cherry blossom trees to Washington, D.C., those gorgeous trees around the tidal basin. And those were, of course, a gift from Japan in 1912. And so in honor of the 100th anniversary, Japan wanted to give cherry blossom trees to select other cities. And Des Moines, the Japanese Bell of Peace and Friendship on the Capitol grounds, is one of those sites. And so we will be receiving 20 cherry blossom trees in the spring. And we will celebrate our Sakula celebration will be in conjunction with the Iowa Asian Festival on May 12th. And so it's a great celebration all day long, and our Sakula celebration will take place that afternoon at the Bell.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
You bet.
Well, let me just move down the line here and talk a little bit to Sonia Rang. Hi, Sonia.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you for writing the commentary that appeared in the paper earlier this week that spoke a little bit about the topics we were covering tonight. You are the head of the of CAPS, the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies here at the University of Iowa, and you're an anthropologist as well. And I think it's a wonderful thing to have a Center for Asian and Pacific Studies here. What does that really add to the university or to our outreach on these topics beyond our own campus?
Sure. Well, Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, in acronym it's called CAPS, is under international programs. There are so many, very many exciting things happening in CAPS. Well, there are a few missions that I want to mention. First of all, the center support the research and teaching for the faculty, not just any specific college, but the university as a whole. And then secondly, we do a lot of the, let's say, promotion about Asia and teaching and researching about Asia on campus and outside. And accordingly, we do a lot of outreach activities. And in fact, for the last 2 or 3 years, we've worked very closely with the Iowa school teachers. If I can mention that currently between 500 and 600 high school students in the state of Iowa are learning Japanese. This is actually a very big number, considering only 1.7% of Iowa's population can trace Asian heritage. I'm not just talking about Japanese, but Asian heritage is 1.7%. So we want to be prepared for these high school graduates who want to come here and pursue their interest in Japan and Japanese culture and language. Well, there's the most recent thing that I can actually tell you, the workshop that we are anticipating. At this point, we're still in preparation, but it's very close to completion in terms of preparation. We are organizing a workshop on W.E.B. Du Bois and Japan. Do you know who W.E.B. Du Bois is? Yes, he was a pre-war African-American thinker, very highly educated man, profound thinker. Now, he saw a real potential in brotherhood of people of color between African Americans and Japanese in the pre-war context. He visited Japan actually in the 1930s, and he wrote about Japan in a very praising tone. And at the same time, he saw China or other colonized or semi-colonized parts, colonized by Japan, other parts of Asia that are semi-colonized by Japan or completely colonized by Japan, in a little inferior manner, in a little inferior light. He thought Japan was much more advanced. It's a very controversial thinking, but it gives us a very interesting angle to think about Japan in the pre-war context, in close connection to the U.S. We are having a workshop on Japan and African America. It's set on April 19th. I'm still trying to figure out the final details of visitors from outside and also everyone from campus invited. So I will, of course, circulate the announcement more formally through Joan's office. But please look forward to that. So these are the things that we do.
Yeah, and you've just celebrated or in the middle of celebrating your 25th anniversary year.
That's right. Yes,
yeah.
We are actually. We just discovered that the center is this year is actually center's 25th anniversary since its foundation. So we designated this year's speaker series as 25th anniversary speaker series. Now we are going to actually carry it through to the September and October and November. So this year, 2012, will be Center's 25th anniversary year speaker series. We have a lot of really heavyweight, if you like, intellectual leaders in this area of Asian studies from across the country. So please, I will again circulate make sure that the announcement will reach you. So please follow us. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. And Downing, I might just turn back to you for a second and ask you to talk a little bit about internationalization here at our campus at the University of Iowa.
Well, there's a great deal of growth right now, and interest in academic opportunities abroad, but also just learning more about other cultures and how to connect with people in different parts of the world. I'd say one of the things, going back to the trip in Japan, that we learned is that there's a great deal of concern in Japan about both the declining population, with the very slow rate of population replacement in Japan compared to other industrialized nations, and in addition, a declining rate of studying abroad by Japanese students. We heard that both in our meeting at the Ministry of Education and at the embassy. And so both on the U.S. side and the Japanese side, there's a great deal of interest in creating opportunities for exchanges and study abroad. In fact, the embassy has stepped in. The normal organizations that do study abroad fairs for the U.S., for U.S. universities and colleges, had really pulled out because of declining attendance and interest. And so one of the things we heard is the need to reach out and the need to encourage U.S. students to travel abroad, to study abroad, to have internships and other kinds of experiences abroad in Japan in particular, and that we should look for ways to welcome Japanese students here in the U.S.
Yeah, great. Well, I know that we have had our own ambassador for Japan working with particularly elementary age kids, but also other students and senior centers, giving public library talks and so on for the last year and a half, and that is Yume Hidaka. And you are here as a Japan Outreach Initiative coordinator. And tell us about what you've been doing.
Okay, so I am in the program called Japan Outreach Initiative. We call it JOY program. The program is designed by the Japan Foundation and Laurasian institutions. It's a 2-year program to send a coordinator, Japanese native coordinators to the United States, not West Coast, not East Coast, because majority of Japanese are already there. So sending coordinators to southern part of the United States and the Midwest to develop deeper understanding about Japan. So I am here in University of Iowa to cover whole state of Iowa. As John mentioned, K-12 schools, just senior citizens, companies, public library, everywhere to drive, visit, and talk about Japan.
You have put hundreds and hundreds of miles on your car in these 2 years.
Yes,
You've been to lots of places I've never been, and I've grown up in Iowa, lived here my whole life. So you have really been beating the pavement. And I see some of the letters that come back from teachers and the school kids who have enjoyed your presentation so much on Japan. What do you think they've enjoyed the most?
Well, so I visit both schools or communities around Iowa City, also rural area schools. So, for example, Iowa City, it's a college town, and it's a diversity town. So if I go to the Iowa City School District, I see many ethnicity students. But for example, going to the rural area schools, I just visited a small town called Charlington last week. Charlington, yes. It's about 2.5 hours driving from here. But I had a wonderful experience because whole the school, classroom, no other ethnicities, but all the Caucasian students. Also, when I ask about, do you know about sushi? Do you like sushi? They have no idea what is sushi. Students here, Iowa City, yes, they say, yeah, I love sushi. Or some students say, no, I don't like them. But they already knew what they are. But those earlier students have no idea what is sushi. So I bring the culture and some informations to introduce those kids. And then I am always hoping that in the future they remind me and try to travel or study abroad or just think about what it is Japan.
Sure.
Yeah.
And some of the presentations you make might relate to things like what a day is like in the life of a school child in Japan.
Yes.
I've seen that presentation, and talk about some of the things that would be interesting to an American school kid.
School life in Japan, there are a lot of similarity and differences. For example, I like talking about cleanup time, for example. From elementary school through high school, all the kids, we are required to clean up on classroom or any common space, hall, bathroom, outside, everywhere. Every school has like 15 to 20 minutes every day for cleanup time. So every time I talk about this to the kids, all the kids, of course, American kids, they say, "Oh, wow!" And then, of course, ending up, I always ask, "Would you like to go to the school in Japan?" And they say, "No." Well, it's only like some differences, but those are, I think, a lot of differences, and then kids never had any idea.
Yeah. Well, and you've dressed the students or maybe their teachers in some of the traditional clothing, and they enjoy that?
Yes. Sometimes I bring uniforms from school in Japan, or I bring yukata, which is like kimono made by cotton fabric, and then try to put them on. And, of course, they're excited.
Yeah. What has been your biggest surprise about Iowa?
Oh, well, a lot of surprising. Of course, this is my first time to live in the United States. I spent about 10 years living in Yokohama and working in Tokyo, so I know what big city is. I still remember the very first day when I arrived to Iowa. Actually, my previous supervisor drove me over from Chicago because we had a training there, and she took me I-80, and I was on the car. Never seen the corn farm.
Cornfield.
Cornfield,
You've never seen a cornfield?
yes.
Yeah.
And I get really nervous, like where's she taking me to, and where I'm going to be. Because of my life in metro area was buildings, all the public transportations, and almost never seen the huge Midwest cornfield. So that was a lot of kind of culture shock for me. But living life in here is a lot of comfortable.
You have next to you there some things that we should explain. Should we start first with the poster board?
Okay, so those pictures, I got this opportunity through the General Consulate of Japan at Chicago. But this is a picture from students affected area by earthquake and tsunami last March 11th. It's been about 1 year. And they drove for many different topics, but what they tried to send a message was they want to thank you to people around the world because those kids still remember about a year ago. Sorry, and they appreciate people around the world for donations, for the surprise, and all the thought from around the world. So they decided to start drawing for showing their appreciation. So I am trying to share with as many Iowa community as I can.
Yeah. And I see that some of the drawings are about imagining oneself 10 years in the future. And being happy again, being able to play outside again.
Yes.
Yeah. Huh. So when you go back to Japan and you continue your work there, what do you expect to be doing?
Well, of course, I can't wait to eat real Japanese food. Yes, I can't wait to see my family, friends there, to share with my experience in Iowa, because a lot of Japanese travel to United States or any other countries, but not all of them, or not most of them, visit the Midwest or Iowa. So I think I can talk about Iowa life and then to bring people over in the future.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. And a little later we'll talk about the dolls, too.
Sure.
Sonia, let me ask you something about the Asian community in the Midwest, Asian community in Iowa. I know you do a lot of work in your own anthropological area about life for Asians here in our state. And I know that recently you were doing some work regarding healthcare access. Is there anything you can share on that?
Yes. Well, in terms of Japan, we really have very few people. But Asian community in Iowa, although it is very small in number, but it's extremely diverse. And in some cases, only a few hundred people, they would speak their own language, and they will not be able to communicate with other Asian communities. Even when, for example, people from Burma, there are many, many different ethnicities from Burma. We've accepted a few of them, quite a few hundreds of them as refugees, and we continue to accept them as refugees from Burma. And of course, we are the first state to have accepted the Vietnamese refugees in the U.S., as well as Dai Dam people. They are the how can I say, ethnic minorities that existed in Vietnam. Well, they lost their kingdom a long time ago, a couple of centuries ago, and their original kingdom spread in the southern China, in Vietnam, and Thailand. So it's no longer actually coverable in a nicely, clean-cut national state border. But anyway, lots of Dai Dam people were displaced in Laos, and then it was the then governor, I can't remember, not Lee anyway.
Governor Ray?
Yes, Ray, Governor Ray, yes, he accepted the lot of Dai Dam people. In fact, Des Moines is the, well, let me put it this way, about 10,000 Dai Dam people live in the U.S. currently, but Des Moines has 8,500 Dai Dam people. So I met, let's say, I conducted focus group focusing on the diverse ethnic groups. And then sometimes I had to put a few ethnic groups together because of the number, the balance. It was very interesting. I have to tell you, especially Southeastern Asian people who came to the U.S. and came to Iowa originally as refugees, they are very grateful. They are very, very grateful for the state of Iowa for having accepted them from the and rescued them from very hopeless situation. But I also have to say, because of that, and maybe combined with their cultural tradition, they do not necessarily demand the rights or entitlement that I think they can. Sometimes they don't even try to claim the things that we normally can claim as citizens. They are, of course, fellow citizens. So I'm trying to figure out how to, for example, encourage elderly Asians, Iowans with Asian heritage, to go and have their health checked every year, because they do not go see doctors unless they have some pain or they got injured, for example. But annual care, the checkup is actually beneficial for them and also for our state economy and for everybody in the long run, as you know. So these things, in order to let the people know these things, I am actually producing a booklet that consists of 6 different languages, and then I will print 700 of them. And currently, I am still designing the text, what kind of content I should have in these booklets. So once that's done, I'm hoping that I'll be able to make some difference for the people of Iowa with Asian heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And also just thinking again of Iowa's agricultural outreach and clearly the importance of Asian markets. Is there a lot happening at the state level here, that anything that you can share with us regarding connections made between Iowa exporters and, I don't know if you know anything specifically about Japan, but Asia generally? I take it this is a big target market for Iowa?
I'm sure, and I should know better, but I actually don't know much about it. And the only thing I know is that we export a lot of tractors to Japan. Now, of course, with the recent disaster situation, I am not sure how things are changing. As Levi said early on, the things are still very, very bad in Japan.
Yeah. And Carol, let's
I
talk
forgot
a
to
little
mention
bit
my
about
book. Yes, actually, it's not my book. I briefly recap the story of the Yamanashi and Iowa relationship, and that story was captured delightfully in a children's book called Sweet Corn and Sushi, and the author is Iowa City native, well, maybe not native, but Iowa native, and now residing in Iowa City, Lori Erickson, and it's illustrated by Will Thompson, who is also here in Iowa City. And it tells the whole story of the hog lift and the sister-state relationship, and it's written in both English and in Japanese, and it's a grade school level book, so it's a delightful story.
And what's the name again? Sushi and Sweet Corn?
Sweet Corn and Sushi.
Sweet Corn and
That's
Sushi.
right.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, so we have just enough time to talk a little bit more about the sister-state relationship, what that really means. You said there are 8
There are 8
relationships?
Iowa currently has 8 sister states, and they vary in terms of how active they are, and the relationship with Yamanashi is one of the most active ones, as well as being the longest in duration. The activities that go on between Iowa and our various sister states can make the entire gamut of range from youth delegations. We've had our Iowa soccer kids go to China and Japan, and now they're heading to the Yucatan, which is another one of our sister states. We have cultural exchanges and cuisine exchanges, particularly with our sister state in Italy, the Veneto region, and so that it can just be of any regard. So it's very interesting and very exciting, and always that personal connection between Iowans and the ordinary people in our sister states.
Yeah. How does the relationship get established? Is this by governor's proclamation? Or?
Yes, with one exception, they all are governor-to-governor agreements, and that's makes them official sister state relationships. I mentioned one of them is an exception, and that is the Yucatan relationship. It came to being in 1964, so it's the second oldest one, as a result of the Kennedy administration. I believe it was Partners of the Alliance was the business arm of North American and South American trade, and he wanted a public side, and so the Partners of the Americas was started at that time, and Iowa was paired with Yucatan.
I see. Yeah.
So the others are all governor to governor, originated, but then it goes all the way down to kids.
But it comes back to this idea Downing was talking about, cultural diplomacy, person-to-person contacts being really
citizen diplomacy.
The most lasting way to...
Most often our visitors stay in homes, and likewise, when we go there, it does depend on the delegation, but that's really the best way to really get to know the other cultures, to stay with them.
Which is actually what you're doing, right? You live with families during your 2 years here. You have lived with a number of different families for a few months at a time, and some have children at home, some do not. And
yes, I requested actually to stay with a homestay family because I think that's the best way to learn American culture.
Yeah. Well, as we get ready to wrap up here, describe these dolls that you have brought with you, and tell us, what we're looking at.
Okay. Tomorrow, March 3rd, is Japanese Girls' Day. So we celebrate for girls, and the traditionally we display, we call it Hina Matsuri, Hina doll, but this Girls' Day doll we display inside the house during the Girls' Day celebrations, and then just celebrate, enjoy eating, family gathering.
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure I heard you correctly. Did you say Girls' Day?
Girls' Day.
I
yes.
see. Uh-huh. Yeah.
So these dolls are actually mine. I asked my parents to send me over last year. So I thought it would be great to share today with all, since tomorrow is the Girls' Day.
Sure. And the male doll, is that an emperor?
Yeah, the man doll is an emperor, and the woman is empress.
And can you tell us about the clothing?
They're wearing kimono.
Yeah.
And usually the traditionally way the emperor empress wear the many layers of kimono. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and so most families would have a celebration doll like this, or just children would?
Just children.
Yeah.
So the family has a girl's child. They usually prepare for the celebrations. I do remember my parents got this for me when I was maybe first grade of elementary school.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about religion, religious celebrations. I don't know if you would care to share something from your family or families about the discussion about Buddhism and family practices of religion and so on. Is there any observation you can make?
Well, I grew up maybe unusual family background, but my father is a Buddhist, my mom is a Christian, 1% of whole Japan population. But so I went to. I describe myself as a non-religion person, but I went to the Catholic high school and university. Spent 4 years in the Catholic dormitory with the nuns. So I have kind of unique experience.
Yeah. Anything else we've been talking about tonight that when you hear it from your cultural background?
Well, of course I agree all the professors, but my experience is a little bit different. So I go to church, I pray, but the other hand, we go to temple, play. So there is some unique aspects. But I agree with the professors, yes.
And you hosted a Japanese film festival earlier in the year that received a lot of interest from students. You had large crowds there to watch these 4 films that you brought in, and they had great names. Kamikaze Girl, or
yes. Last November, I got an opportunity through the Japan Foundations to have a Japanese film event, and we played 4 different movies at the Visual in University of Iowa. It was great experience as well. A lot of students from UI, also the public people attended there. It was really successful.
Well, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming, and everybody who was on the program earlier. Thank you so much. We have, I think, come close to the end of our program here, so I want to remind you that this program will be available on television, on UI TV, if you would like to watch it again, also on Iowa Public Radio and KRUI. WorldCanvass is a production of international programs at the University of Iowa. Production partners are UI TV, the UI Pentecrest Museums, KRUI, and Information Technology Services. And we will be posting this program on iTunes in just the next few days. Please join us on April 13th at 5 o'clock in this room for our next WorldCanvass. And the topic that night is global science fiction. So many thanks to all of you, Downing Thomas, Carol Grant, Sonia Ryang, and Yume Hidaka. And thanks to all of you who've come here to join us this evening. Thanks to Mike McBride and his team at UITV. I'm Joan Kerr. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Good night.